Hi, welcome to our talk on harnessing the power of AVV to create next-level realism in the Seventh Guest. I'm Devin, CTO of Arcturus.
And I'm Paul. I was the lead project lead on the Seventh Guest VR for Vertigo Games.
Today, we're going to introduce the Seventh Guest VR. We're going to describe what volumetric video is. We'll talk over the production workflow for the game using a scene from the Seventh Guest VR as an example. And we're going to introduce Arcturus's high-performance codec, AVV, which makes this possible.
Okay, so in the 90s, the Seventh Guest was released and wowed players with its revolutionary graphics, its animations, and full motion video. It was a technological breakthrough title for the new CD-ROM format. It was the killer app before apps existed. And as a specialized VR studio and publisher, Vertigo Games is always committed to offer players the most engaging experience in VR because we see VR as the new technological breakthrough. So what better game to bring back than the game that helped jumpstart the CD-ROM revolution? And apart from that, walking around in a haunted mansion solving puzzles is just a very cool thing to do in VR. So let's take a quick peek at the trailer to show what we will be talking about.
It's you! Don't be afraid. I'm here to help. There are many like me here, trapped in this house. Each night, the guests arrive.
Stout, what do you want? Show yourself!
So when we and co-developer XKey started production on the reimagining of the Seventh Guest 4 VR, we quickly ran into a challenge. Like, what do we do with the full motion video that the original was known for? The blue screen footage of real-life actors, replacing those with rigged models, that just didn't feel right. For me, the holy grail in VR is seeing other people. With an actor, it's the performance, it's the smirk, it's the raised eyebrow, it's the fold of a jacket or a dress that is just very natural to see in VR. There's no uncanny valley there. So it was key for us to have those real actors in a way that the original game had as well, but now for VR, so in fully 3D. But how to do that? Luckily, there is such a technique for 3D video that works in VR, and that's called volumetric video. And one of the dominant players in that burgeoning market is Arcturus, and they focus on the compression of these videos because they're huge in size. And yeah, we approached them and talked about the project that we had. And we said, look, we've got these group scenes in our game with up to 6 characters talking, and at the same time, players will still be running around doing things. And oh yeah, it needs to run on standalone headsets. So that was a big ask, but they were up for it. They're up for a challenge, and they saw the appeal of a game like this to become a showcase for what volumetric video can be. So yeah, they had to get it running on a 2 millisecond budget on a standalone headset.
You're killing us.
Yes, we did. We were harsh. And Devin can give you a brief overview of what volumetric video actually means.
So what's volumetric video? Well, you can imagine coming into a volume, like a large green screen room, and around the room there's, say, 50 to 100 camera sensors, they're all pointing inward. So it's an outside-in capture volume. And each one of those cameras is linked to each other through a network, and they're all taking an image at the same moment, thanks to synchronized shutters. That data is all kind of flowing through to compute, and that data, when it's coming into compute, is about 2 terabytes of data per minute of footage. This is huge, massive amount of data. And then it's reconstructed into a 3D model and a texture that's wrapped around that 3D model. And there's one of those for every frame of the data. That reconstructed data will end up being about 2 gigabytes per minute. And that's still way too big to deliver to viewers. So the compression comes in after that, and we're looking to target 50 to 150 megabytes a minute compressed data. That's a huge challenge. We'll talk about how we do that in a little bit.
Yeah, so while Arcturus was busy with the compression side of things, we were busy with the production of the game. I'll quickly take you through our process. In short, it's very similar to a film shoot. We hired a professional scriptwriter. We got an external film producer on board. He took care of the crew. We were lucky enough to have an in-house director. That's not a luxury that most studios have, but luckily we had. But usually that would be an external person as well. And with the producer and the director in place, we could start the casting. We did that through a casting agency. And luckily for us, Vertigo Games is based in the Netherlands. There was a volumetric capture studio in the Netherlands as well, called 4DR. And we told them what we wanted to do, and they were very excited about the prospect of it. And they needed to know very specifically what we were planning to do for each scene so they could make specific props for that. More about that later. Internally, we started blocking out scenes as well, making animatics and acting out scenes ourselves. We went to the capture studio to do a one-day test shoot. That's to test wardrobe, hairstyles, and all that. And 3 months later, we had our actual film shoot at the end of January in 23. Now, when you wrap the shoot, you don't take away the footage straight away. It's a massive amount, and it needs to be rendered out properly to get all the high-quality footage. And yeah, because of that, you need to specify exactly which takes you want, right down to the second. And then the post-production cleanup takes, or can take a couple of months. This all depends on how much footage there is, how complicated the shots are, but it is something to take into account. You can add more people to the post-production, but that really depends on the deal that you have with the capture studio. So let's take a closer look at one scene in particular in the game, the library scene. When we had the first draft of the script ready, we started filming ourselves. It's just really basic setup in our own studio. We just put up a green screen and started acting it out. For those sensitive to bad acting, now would be a good time to look away.
Just now these bookcases were moving by themselves. And earlier in my room, a skeleton came alive in front of my very eyes. Well, I didn't see anything.
I saw blood. How strange. Well, I didn't see anything either. I expected more of Mr. Stauff. I'm going to the kitchen. If I'm lucky, there'll be a ghost serving drinks.
Wait! This house is dangerous, evil. We should team up. Stay together.
Don't be such a bore, darling.
It's a game. That's why we're invited. A game. Everyone for himself. He's watching us play his puzzles. Only he knows the rules. Only Stauff knows the rules.
So this is a great way to embarrass devs. But it's also very useful to us as well, because it gives our director a chance to hear the script out loud, already start working on the blocking of the actors. And as you saw, there were like 3 white circles in the room. That was the size of the capture volume that we would have in the capture studio later on. Each circle was about 9 foot in diameter, and we used that. We placed them throughout the room. We wanted to get as much of the room as possible. But in the end, that didn't really work out well because it didn't feel like a group. They were scattered too much across the room. There was no sense of them being a group. Eye lines were sort of weird. And we can sort of trigger the scene in the game itself when the player steps in a specific spot. From that point on, the player can move wherever they want. We're not locking them down or anything. But for this scene, we didn't even know where exactly the player should be ideally positioned. What would be the best place for the player to take it all in? So we thought, okay, interesting experiment, but let's iterate a little further on it. So we ended up with this blocking that was 2 circles. So the scene would be shot in 2 different takes, with an A group and a B group, and we centered it around the couch there, which gave us a much clearer position for the player. You can see in the top right corner the position where the player would ideally be positioned. In the lower left corner you see an animatic from that point of view of the player. And what we got out of this as well was defining a north. Because in the studio, the capture studio, you're surrounded by a sea of green. There's this room where you're in and everything is green and lights and cameras. So it's very easy to get sort of lost. And we could just decide at the start of the shoot, like, okay, this is going to be the north. Like that camera, one of those cameras, that one specifically, that's our north. And with every top-down view, we could say that's north as well. So that's where the door is going to be. This is where the walls are going to be. And that was very helpful for the cast and crew to make sense of things. I mentioned the test shoot, and this is a screen grab of what we got out of that. I'm the one on the left testing a suit. The guy in the middle is our director. And the lady on the right is in charge of wardrobe. And this told us a couple of things. It told us, like, will the wardrobe choices work? Will a texture on a suit work well when compressed or captured? Told us a couple of other things. The director has a lovely set of curls, but that just turned into a sort of blobby helmet. So that didn't work. There are certain hairstyles that do work. And when you're dealing with a good studio, a good capture studio, they'll tell you, do this, don't do that. But even they say, okay, do a test shoot, but because we can't predict anything or everything in advance. One of the things is, you can't see it, but our director was actually holding a blade of a knife. And that was just too thin to get picked up properly by the cameras. There were other instances in the story. The guests arrive in the mansion and they get a letter from the main villain, an invitation, and they read it. But again, that piece of paper wouldn't capture properly, so we ended up using music boxes, which does capture well. It fit the context of the game, so that was a good solution for that. But the blade was so vital to the story. Spoilers, people get stabbed. And we didn't want to change that, so we say, okay, we'll keep the blade, but we'll hand animate that one in. And that was a pain in the ass to do, but we got it done. Of course, the cast had to rehearse as well. We had a period of a couple of weeks where they came together, and again, you can see on the ground the circles that we ended up using, in this case, like a sheet, so that the actors knew how much they could move. But the other important thing is they could get the timing right, they could work with each other and learn the eye lines. Because in this instance, they're all together, but when they actually record, they're in 2 separate groups. So finally, we were ready for the shoot. And as you can see, this is one of the groups. That's called the A group. You can see there are props here. There's a little green stool, and there's a wooden pole that the actress sitting down rests her hand on. There's a reason why they're green because they can get keyed out, but also they're very minimal. And that's because the bigger and the more closed off props are, the more they obscure the actors using the props, because the cameras would be all around them. So wherever you place something, it will obscure something behind it, which is also the reason why we could only film 3 people at the same time, because the other actor would obscure another one. This has improved recently, but depending on which studio you work with, this might still be a limitation that you need to take into account. So this is our other group, and what we did is we took the recording of the first group while the second group was in another room talking into a microphone. So group A could hear group B but not see them. So that's why they had to remember, okay, person X is sitting over there, I don't see them, but I hear them, so I need to be looking in that direction. When we've got a take from the A group that we like, we lock it, we say, okay, this is the one, we get that audio, and then group B goes into the green screen room, and then they play against the audio of the take we just selected. And that was all pretty scary, because you hope that that worked, but it would take several months before we could actually see that in the game. And happily to say that it felt pretty seamless. So during the months after the shoot, we got the cleaned up footage back from the studio. And a big thing that 4DR had to do was to separate the actors. There were lots of group scenes in our game, but in order for HoloEdit to properly do the compression as best as they could, they needed a separate actor, because then the software could interpret that way better than in a group scene. And the details of this definitely will go into more. But what we did on our end, we got the high quality footage from the studio, put that through HoloEdit, compressed that to a significant degree without sacrificing the visual quality, and then upload it to the cloud and wait a couple of hours before we got our compressed version back, which is amazing when you think about all these sort of computations that you have to get done before you can get something compressed in a big file size like volumetric video. In the end, we had 2 presets. We had one for low end for the Quest and one for high end for tethered headsets. And their mesh density was the same, but the texture quality was lower on the lower ends.
So what can you do in post-production with volumetric video? HoloEdit, Arcturus's tool that you saw on the last slide, can be used to generate pose skeletons for each frame of the volumetric data, giving you a skeleton that you can use to track props, track colliders for physics interactions, for selection by the player, or to bring into an animation editor like in Maya and reanimate your data to fix some concerns you might have with the performance. So for example, if you had an action sequence and they're pulling punches on the stage, well, you can fix that in post. That's one amazing advantage of volumetric video. You can also generate blends between clips. So if you took, for example, 2 takes of something, it was a long take, the performance was great, except for one minor error, then you could blend from the first clip to the second and use that to cover a gap in the quality of the performance with fewer takes. You can also paint out logos, fix blemishes, and track those across frames in the volumetric video, so you don't have to paint them out every frame.
Yeah, so once we got the compressed files, we could easily import them into, in our case, Unreal, but you could do the same in Unity. And we could put them in a sequencer where we could add voice audio, sound effects, music, visual effects, and the props like the dreaded knife. And then we could quickly play that back in VR just to see how it looked like, and that went very smoothly. And then this is the scene that you end up with.
These bookcases were moving by themselves. And earlier, a skeleton came alive right before my very eyes.
I saw blood.
Well, I was in my room getting my beauty rest. Perhaps you should do the same.
Oh, don't look at me. I didn't see anything. Oh, I'm bored. I'm going to the kitchen. Maybe I can find a talking skeleton that'll pour me a drop of the hard stuff.
Wait! We shouldn't go walking alone. We might be in danger. If you've read anything about Mr. Staub-Stars.
Tell me you don't believe in that gossip. There's no danger. This is just a harmless little party.
This is a game, nothing more. One of us is going to win that prize money. I say, every man for himself.
It may be a game, but only Stealth knows the rules.
Okay, and now Devin is going to dive into the particulars of the compression that pulled this off.
So in volumetric video of the currently available codecs prior to AVV, there's sort of naive encodings that can have a very large bit rate, close to that 2 gigabytes a minute figure. They typically can't be read and rendered in real time, so they're most often used for offline rendering cases. And if you do want to render that in real time, you have to keep all of the data in memory because I/O won't keep up with the read speed you need to display it. And that limits the length of the clip you can show. Obviously, it's huge influence on the disk space you need as well. Current generation encodings are low bandwidth, but they are performance limited owing to a lot of decoding that happens on the CPU. These kind of run length encodings that are used to save on a lot of space mean that you have to decode things serially. And they also rely on video hardware decoders, which are limited on different platforms. So some platforms allow you to decode, say, 1 or 2 videos at any given time, or they have a limit to the total number of pixels you can decode in video hardware. There's also synchronization issues across video decoders. Accelerated volumetric video allows for very high detail streams, up to 16K resolution textures per frame, and up to millions of verts at a time. AVV is very performant. It's got support for dozens of characters on PC hardware. I'll show you in a minute what that might look like. And up to 6 characters in 2 milliseconds on Quest 2. It's got detail management, so it does progressive LODs, not just in rendering cost, but also in disk I/O cost. So you only load in the data you're going to render that frame. And allows for selective decimation, so you can maintain more detail in, say, the face or the hands than, say, the legs of a character. Finally, it supports motion vectors and temporal anti-aliasing, so you can get motion blur or really good and cheap anti-aliasing that's prevalent today in high-end rendering pipelines. To make all this possible, we had 2 core design themes in the codec. The first is that all decode should happen on the GPU. And the second is that video hardware decoding is causing more trouble than it's worth. Too many headaches, too many synchronization problems, and too much cost to introduce a new platform. So we wanted to replace it with something tailor-made for volumetric video. Focusing in on the first theme, let's walk through a few different ways we could decode and look at how that affects the decoding clock time. So we could imagine a naive codec where we're just trying to move the buffers to the GPU and render them as fast as possible. So it's just already coded for display on video hardware, and we're just pulling it off disk, shipping it to the CPU, and then shipping that to the GPU. Because the initial data on disk is so large, you're paying a significant amount to read that data from disk. So that's a huge I/O cost, and then a bunch of time to move it across the bus to the CPU. You're not doing much decoding on the CPU, so that's pretty cheap. But then you're moving again across the bus to the GPU. Now you could work around some of that with direct memory access and this kind of stuff. But at the end, you're still paying this big I/O cost and this big bus cost. What current generation decoders do is they have this little teeny tiny thing on the disk, and that's fast to read off disk, so you got lots of I/O. Okay, then you can move it across the bus pretty cheaply to the CPU. But then on the CPU, all of the mesh data has to be unpacked, and that's all run length encoded and using tricks like Draco, et cetera. And that's mostly done serially, and you're kind of limited by the total number of cores you've got on the CPU. Then you've got unpacked data, which you have to move across the bus, and that's expensive because the data is fairly large. On the GPU, you've got the hardware video decoding. That's nice and fast. So what does AVV do? It stores the data in a format that can be decoded purely on the GPU. That has to take up a little bit extra space compared to current generation volumetric video codecs. But it's still very compact in comparison to the inflated data at the end. You can move that across the bus quickly to the CPU, and barely anything happens on the CPU before it's moved across the bus to the GPU. Then all the inflating happens on the GPU. And it happens in these massively parallelized vector units. And the relative scale comparison for these things is pretty massive. AVV takes about a 50th of the clock time to render as a naive encoding, and it's at least 5 times, but usually more like 10 to 15 times faster than the best current generation encodings out there. What's happening on the CPU during a typical frame update is probably something that most devs want to know. Well, there's the simulation thread, the render thread, and this I/O thread. In the sim thread, you're basically just figuring out which frames you're going to need to update. You might have a whole bunch of AVV streams, and some of them are more distant and less important, and some of them are closer, and some of them have frame updates coming this frame, other ones won't for another couple frames. So it's basically just queuing up which things you want to read first and setting your budget for the frame. So let's say you've got 2 milliseconds to decode. You want to just decode streams until you've reached that budget, and then anything you missed that frame, you're going to come back to the next frame. The render thread is just launching decodes for the frame prior to the current frame. And those are all going into compute and being decoded in compute on the GPU. The disk read thread is basically just reading the current frame queued reads. And it's getting them stored so that they can be passed off to the render thread for the next frame. So in terms of memory budget, you're basically paying 2 frames worth of deflated data for memory budget. And in terms of CPU budget, you're paying very, very little. It's basically just saying what goes in the read thread and launching some compute shaders. In a test of a current generation codec like OMS versus AVV, as we increase the number of streams to about 4, we drop under 60 frames per second. AVV stays high at around 720 in this example. Then as we keep adding actors, you'll notice that we drop and drop and drop. We're basically off the chart really quickly with current generation codecs, but AVV maintains 60 frames a second all the way up to 60 independent streams. These are high detail streams. And this is just commodity hardware, like a 1080 or type of thing. So what exactly are we sticking into the AVV format? For the mesh stream, we've basically got this set of segments. And you can think of it like a segment of a encoded video file. You've got this sort of keyframe, and then you've got these sort of in-between datas that make the keyframe last as long as it can last before the error is too high, and then you start a new segment. That's basically what's going on with the meshes. So each segment has a set of fixed elements and a set of varying elements that are updated each frame. The fixed elements are things like the index buffer, the UV layout, and the block layout that's eventually going to be in the texture. The per frame data is stuff like the vertex position, the vertex color, and the normals. The texture stream is composed of 4 layers. You've got the first layer, which is a vertex kind of approximation of the texture. Then you've got the quarter resolution, the half resolution, and the full resolution texture blocks. Those are all sparse in the data stream, so they're not laid out in the UV layout at this point in time. And that data is all packed really, really tightly and sent across to the GPU. So we'll zoom in on that a little bit more. We can think of the vertex color data as being sort of the lowest MIP of the texture data. So we're using the vertex colors to carry both chroma and luminance values for every point on the mesh is sort of this lowest MIP. Then you've got quarter resolution, half resolution, and full resolution texture blocks that are only storing luminance values. So if you think about color as being, there's the hue and then there's sort of the value, our eyes are much more concerned with whether or not the value is correct than whether or not the hue is correct. So we need less resolution in the sort of hue of a texture than we need in the value. And MPEG and other video formats and texture formats use this to save on data. And those luminance values are stored in BC4 blocks. Those blocks are in a sparse stream, which gets copied into the UV space on the GPU. So let's look at what that looks like. Showing is a lot easier than telling. I've blown Christelle here up and zoomed in a little bit too close for comfort. To the left, you can see the UV space, and on the right, you've got the kind of final image. Here's the first layer. I'm going to flip back and forth a couple times. Final, just the vert colors. Final, just the vert colors. You can see that there's a lot of glossiness there, a lot of artifacts. You can't read the text. The pattern's sharpness is lost. As we add in the first layer of luminance blocks, these are the quarter resolution blocks. The left-hand side just shows the added luminance data, and the right-hand side shows the luminance blocks combined with the vertex color data. Then we add in the second layer of half resolution blocks, and then the final layer. And you can see how that sort of fills in a lot of these details and makes that final image on the right-hand side look a lot more crisp. I'll show you that being added a few times so you can see the difference. And here's the final image again. So here's, what's this character's name? Is it Hamilton?
It's Hamilton.
Yeah, this is Hamilton from the Seventh Guest, and he's This is showing him at full resolution. He takes about 30 megabits per second to render at full resolution texture data. And here's what he looks like at quarter res. That's 12 megabits per second. With this texturing scheme that I talked about before, we get the same 11 megabits per second, but it looks almost identical to the full resolution that I showed earlier. There's 20% of that's half resolution, 20% quarter resolution, and 10% full resolution. The rest is just vertex color data. Finally, for LODs, we want to get as many assets as possible into the scene. And so we use a purpose-built LOD system which saves on the I/O, compute, and render times when things are in the distance. In the lowest LOD, we just load the vertex color data because it's far enough away. That's both in terms of the I/O cost, so we're just reading the portion of the file with the vertex color data, but also when it's being rendered and when it's being decoded. Here's one more view of the scene, so you can see what it looks like from different angles. So our takeaways are performance that used to be a key barrier to volumetric video is solved by AVV, that post-production tools are rapidly improving that enable more options, more flexibility, and more utility in game applications. But the caliber of the stage also has a big impact on the final quality.
Yeah, and from our side, be very diligent in your planning. It's not very flexible. Once you've got it filmed, that's what you've got to deal with, even though you do have post-production tweaks that you can do. It's not easy to completely do something differently apart from reshooting stuff, which is expensive. So really know what you want to get beforehand. But if you do that, the impact of seeing those characters in VR is just very high. Every time a new player comes in, they're just blown away about what they see. They want to sort of get up close and start looking around people, and it's sort of black magic. That's one user termed it black magic. So we'll take that compliment. Once used properly, it's very high impact.
All right, thank you so much. We'll be here, happy to take any questions.
Don't forget to fill out the survey on the talk once you're done, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Hi. My question is, when all was said and done and you had all these scenes set up, did you have any trouble rendering the transparency?
I'll quickly repeat the question.
Yeah.
Did we have any trouble rendering out the transparency? Yes, on Android devices. We have to resort to some sort of dithering to get the ghostly feel of it. On high end, we had a better way to show transparency. Next to that, we also had the particle effects and sort of smokiness to sort of get that ghostly feel going.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. First, congratulations. I've done asynchronous shooting and post-synchronization. It's a feat. Regarding the including the actors in the 3D scene, did you have to do any relighting? Because with volumetric video, you need to shoot with uniform lighting. So can you handle that? Is always the Arcturus, or within the engine? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I can. So the question was, how was relighting handled in this project, and how can relighting be handled? So we'll ask Paul about whether it was done in this project.
Yeah. In our case, since they were ghosts, we didn't really have to take into account how well the lights in the environment would interact with the ghosts. We sort of figured, well, the ghosts are sort of translucent, so we didn't have to bother with that in this particular case. But definitely, you said, like earlier today, that there are ways to approach relighting and lighting.
Yeah, so I'll just go pop back to this frame. So this is a fully relit character. You can relight volumetric video fairly well, depending on how you shoot it and what ways you use to encode it. So you're trying to balance a few different things. Per frame normals can be fairly expensive. You can encode those either into a texture map. That's not available on the market right now, but it's coming soon. Or you can have a higher density mesh that has more normals. So the quality of the stage really matters here to get good quality normals for relighting. You also have to be concerned about, what are the materials? How reflective are they supposed to be? Right now, you can't distinguish what is which piece of material from which other piece of the material in the volumetric video. It's another feature that's coming relatively soon, being able to get a segmentation map that tells you, okay, this pixel belongs to material 1, this pixel belongs to material 2. So look for that in the next 6 to 12 months on market. The thing you can do, though, is you can use chroma sampling to determine which type of material it's most likely to be. And you can use that to drive which material properties each pixel on the data has, passing in, say, a more matte value or subsurface scattering shader for the scan, while you use maybe a shiny or a satin material for a piece of clothing. Last thing I'll mention is that when you're shooting, you can actually capture non-flat lighting in the scene. You just need to make sure that the scene is bright enough overall. So one thing you can do is shoot with higher base lighting and then add additional dramatic lighting on top of that. And use kind of more of a cutoff value to reduce the base lighting in post.
So I'm wondering how you handle taking the green out of the footage or the stream, because I'm sure you get bounce from the green, and also how do you clean out the poles and things like that?
Yeah, good question. So there's a lot of different techniques for that. It depends on the specific capture technology you're using. So there's some well-known anti-green spill techniques. Part of that starts with how you light the scene to begin with. So if you've got a lot of reflection off the green screen, then that's going to bounce onto your actors. So light the capture properly in the first place is the number one thing. But then there's all the techniques from video production apply here for green spill. They're basically the same. So you use those for green spill. In terms of areas where you have occlusions and you have poor reconstruction because of the occlusion, it's important to set up your cameras in the first place so you reduce the likelihood of that happening. So you want things to be seen by ideally 6+ cameras. Now, if you're shooting on a more a sparser rig, then you might have to make special considerations in the scene blocking or the angles you're using to avoid those occlusions. Finally, you can use AI segmentation as part of aiding how it reconstructs in the occluded areas, but that really depends on the capture technology you're working with.
Oh, and as far as props, is the skeleton that you get not good enough? If you wanted to replace that knife with a 3D knife, is the skeleton not good enough to use in that fashion?
Yeah, good question. So the question was, using the skeleton, can you add a 3D knife in without any additional post or animating? I would say that that we have some tools for Maya that you can use to minimize the level of work when you add a prop in, and to track that with things other than just the skeleton. The skeleton does have a little bit of jitter. You sort of need to do a skeleton smoothing pass. Sometimes when you do the smoothing pass, then you're not going to have like kind of like pixel to pixel lock across frames, and your props will jitter around with the motion or look like they're swimming a little bit. You can address that usually with like sort of per frame tweaks, but also use aforementioned Maya plugin, which tracks kind of like visible points on the surface instead of just using a skeleton.
Yeah, and in our case, because it was VR, players are so close to the action that a little bit of swimming becomes very obvious very quickly. And also, the knife got handed from one character to the other. It sort of fell on the floor. They were picking it up, sort of rotating it around, making stabbing motions. That was not something that the skeleton would be able to handle in all cases. So there were lots of edge cases already where we're like, okay, we need to take it out of the skeleton's hand and then reanimate this part ourselves and then attach it mid-scene and hopefully it doesn't snap. So at some point it's like, okay, forget about that. We'll just hand animate that bit.
And you couldn't have like a stand-in prop that could be tracked and then removed somehow? You mentioned maybe trying to detect what the material was. Maybe you have, a bright red fake sword that you can delete and then replace.
Yep, that's certainly possible. We've seen that workflow. There's various productions that we've been a part of that have used that workflow. So it's workable. You have to be set up to do that, but yeah, it's workable.
Thank you.
You good? Oh, thanks. I did have a question about talking about action and action scenes, about the camera speed and how it could capture that. I know you mentioned there was some maybe like pulling punches or how quickly it could take in information, the camera, to take in any quick action.
Yeah, great. So that's one of the key concerns with getting your stage built right. If you are building a stage, of course, the Arcturus capture systems get all this taken care of, but you've got balance between like the amount of light that gets into the sensor, the amount of noise that you get by turning up the sensitivity of the sensor, and the amount of time the shutter is open, so the amount of motion blur you get. And you're looking for the right balance of not too bright for the actors, fast enough that you can get crisp action without too much motion blur, and so on and so forth. So you have to have quality cameras, quality lights, and quality lenses. That's the first thing. But yeah, you certainly can get high-speed action that reconstructs well. When you have very thin objects, like say a golf club, a katana blade, things like that, that's where you start to get a little less feasible without significantly more sensitive capture devices.
Cool.
My question is, why, when you were doing all of the volumetric things, are you meshing everything and not using things more like Gaussian splatting and more techniques like that? Is there performance differences? Is that like one of the primary things, or was it any particular reason? And is there any, path forward on, doing the same type of accelerations that you did on these things in order to also do those types of volumes?
Yeah, so the question was, why aren't we using different representations besides meshes? Say points, Gaussian splats, things like nerfs, I'm sure are questions that are coming up. So first we have to remember that those technologies are like sub 1.5 years old for the most part. So like this project was probably conceived prior to the existence of those research results. But a couple things to note. So one thing that's not super clear, or hasn't been super clear probably to people who have seen splat-based results, is that those are done with a large number of views. So you're increasing the number of cameras that you need to have to get good results. Second, the memory time trade-off that's used in things like Gaussian splats is very high on memory. So without a new compression technique that's oriented towards splats, that wouldn't work with the memory budget for a project like this. Certainly with NeRFs, the issue is the time it takes to render them, and you can't do that in real time with most NeRF technologies. So it's really that this is the feasible combination of affordable in terms of performance, but also in terms of the number of cameras, the production cost, and all that kind of stuff, memory budget, that still gives you what you're looking for.
Thanks.
Yep. But keep your eyes tuned. Those things are making their way into these technologies.
I do a fair bit of research in this space.
Yeah.
That's my curiosity.
I asked my question already, but I forgot one part of it. Was this all done in Unreal Engine?
Yes, it was.
Mobile to high-end PC?
Sorry?
Like whether on mobile or on high-end PC, it was all Unreal?
It was the same build.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. I mean, I should clarify, it was the same project. There were different builds for Android devices, the standalone headsets, but same project, same engine.
That looks like all the questions. Thank you all so much for coming. Yeah, thank you.